going to start with Dr. Christopher Curry. Born in the Bahamas, Christopher Curry earned his doctorate degree in history from the University of Connecticut in 2011. Currently, he serves as Associate Professor of History and Head of the History Department at the University of the Bahamas. Outside of professional responsibilities, Dr. Curry has published a number of books and articles. In the spring of 2017, he published a thematic study entitled Freedom Resistance, A Social History of Black Loyalists in the Bahamas. In 2019, Dr. Curry was involved in an IDB publication in which he co-authored a chapter titled From Punishment to Rehabilitation, A Historical Survey of Attitudes Towards Crime. And apart from various publications, it is worth noting that Dr. Curry has presented papers at several important academic conferences, including Harvard University's 2010 Atlantic World Summer Institute. Additionally, he has been involved with numerous public relation engagements, including talk shows, roundtable discussions, television interviews, and I have to add, former chair of the Bahamas National Reparations Committee. And our previous presenter is also a member of the Bahamas National Reparations Committee. And our presenter after that is also a member as well. So that might be a theme. So please, let's welcome Dr. Christopher Curry.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. It certainly is a pleasure to be here this afternoon. This is not my first rodeo for the Future of Democracy Conference series, and I don't think it'll be my last, but I'm excited about the one that I'm going to present today. Let me just say that what I'm going to present is going to be published as a book. I plan to send this to the publisher tonight. So I'm going to share with you what the cover of the soon-to-be published book will look like. It is a co-authored text entitled Constructing a New Country, Nation Formation, and the Emergence of the Modern Bahamas, 1920 to 2020. Dr. Tinker and I benefited from 2 grants from the Wilson Foundation, which we're very pleased and happy about. This has been a long journey of over 3 years in the making. And what I'm going to present is segments or snippets of the book, but I've worked in a theory based on the work of James Scott. Some of you may know his work. If you don't, you will soon find out. So without further ado, I will begin my presentation. In December 1963, a meeting was held at the Pinling home on Soldier Road that would have reverberations for the future of the Progressive Liberal Party, and by extension, the political history of the Bahamas. On that night, a small group of PLPs met to challenge the order and direction which the party appeared to be headed. Led by Paul Adderley, the group included Orville Turnquest, Cyril Stevenson, Milo Butler, and Spurgeon Bethel, who were increasingly alarmed about Pinley's alleged shift away from centrist politics and his rumored distancing of H.M. Taylor from the helm of the party which Taylor had helped found only 10 years earlier. The toxic mix of rumor and conjecture was exacerbated by an alleged plan by Pinling not to recommend Taylor, the former chairman of the PLP, for an appointment as one of 2 senators under the impending Constitution for Internal Self-Government that was to be ratified in early January of 1964. It appeared history was working in retrograde motion for a group of PLPs that held ties to a party chairman who represented the old guard of conservative moderates rather than the vanguard of younger progressives who were emerging out of the ashes of the failed 1962 general election. In short, Pinling was shifting away from the light-skinned leadership of Taylor, Cartwright, and Stevenson, and their perceived willingness to make concessions to the oligarchy at times, to a younger and more energetic PLP membership who embraced a broader platform. This platform centered on improving the lives of the black masses and deploying a direct attack against white minority rule. Several of these younger devoted members were attracted or attached to the burgeoning National Committee for Positive Action, NCPA, a loosely configured organization in the party promoting progressive ideals in the 1960s. As the conservative group huddled at Pinling's residence on that fateful evening, the political tension seemed to increase. Determined to convince Pinling of his errors, Paul Adderley met privately in the bedroom with Pinling, while Orville Turnquest, Spurgeon Bethel, Cyril Stevenson, and Milo Butler remained in the living room. Sensing a potential mutiny, Pinling's wife, Marguerite, called the office of the Bahamian Times, declaring that Adderley and his group were forcing her husband to resign as leader of the PLP. Members of the NCPA, including Arthur Folks, then editor of the Bahamian Times newspaper, Eugene Nuri, Clement Maynard, Jeffrey Thompson, and Warren Laverty, wasted precious little time in descending upon Pinling's home and rescuing him from what amounted to a political crisis at the hands of the conservative elements of the party. Of the collective group of would-be rescuers, the two most prominent in effectively saving Pinling from such an impetuous decision were Warren Laverty and Arthur Folks, men who did most of the work for the NCPA. Given the intense political theater unfolding that evening, it would have been easy to move from historic facts to hyperbole, particularly given the likely intentions of Adderley and his group of conservatives. Indeed, it is doubtful that they were actually engaged in a coup, but were merely attempting to convince Pinling to reevaluate the shifting politics of the PLP in favor of more conservative measures. In essence, Adderley was concerned about the direction of the party and what may, in hindsight, appear to have been a sharp bend towards radicalization due to the increasing influence of the young reformers mentioned above. The Christmas coup of 1963 is important for understanding an important but often ignored aspect of Bahamian political discourse. Those meetings held in secret or clandestine places, spaces where cameras and reporters and crowds are not present. Storr and Morton have argued regarding the Black Tuesday event of April 27, 1965, that the public space of Bay Street was a staging ground for political theater in which the power base of the oligarchy was demystified. Such public transcripts and political theater, both inside the House of Assembly and on Bay Street, have received much attention by scholars and journalists alike. But I wish to argue today that often important decisions and political discourses are shaped by meetings that are not public. They happen in the luminous world of the hidden transcript. And I bring to your attention now a book that is the theoretical base of my study. In Domination and the Arts of Resistance, Hidden Transcripts, James Scott explores the subtlety of resistance and the ways in which the powerless and the powerful interact within social structures. Scott's work emphasizes that resistance is not always overt rebellion, but rather a subtle form of contesting power through everyday behaviors and language. This theory is particularly useful for understanding the dynamics of power in various cultures and societies, including, of course, our own Bahama land. Confrontations between the powerless and powerful are laden with deception, according to Scott. The powerless feign deference, and the powerful subtly assert their mastery. Peasants, serfs, untouchables, slave laborers, and prisoners are not free to speak their minds in the presence of power. These subordinate groups instead create a secret discourse that represents a critique of power spoken behind the backs of the dominant. At the same time, the powerful also develop a private dialogue about practices and goals of their rule that cannot be openly avowed. Scott further describes the ideological resistance of subordinate groups, their gossip, folktale, songs, jokes, and theater, their use of anonymity and ambiguity, all very important to his theory. However, reworking Scott's theory to the Bahamian context, I argue that conclaves, secret meetings, and conferences offer an opportunity for the political directorate to diffuse tension and challenges by those within the party that are subtly attempting to challenge the leadership. Often those who are perceived as challenging the leader at these clandestine meetings are powerless in the sense that they are seen as outside of the circle of leadership, part of a fringe minority group, or simply out of step with the current direction of the party. I'm sure you're seeing where I'm headed with this, right? If not, I'm sure I will do my best to explain. So secret meetings, conclaves, and conferences provide opportunities for the powerful and powerless in Bahamian society to perform their roles in subtle ways which attempt to change or shift the political discourse or power structure. And here it's worth revisiting an earlier period in our history and the Atlantic world history. In the period of enslavement and extending to post-slavery racial societies, such behavior and discourses were described and expressed as a subtle masking effect of dissemblance. And you would know from scholarship that W.E.B. Du Bois, among others, spoke eloquently about this idea. The idea of dissemblance, really, and more colloquially known as putting on for massa, became a survival skill for addressing the asymmetrical power relations of race in America. You might smile and fake fidelity in order to achieve greater gains and rewards. And that, in fact, is a strategy for resistance in itself, yes? More contemporary examples are worth noting. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, many black women were thrust into chaotic atmospheres and were exposed emotionally, physically, and sexually in ways largely undocumented. There is a recent film that I watched on Netflix about Katrina, and it was quite telling about how Katrina was a low point in American history and how it racialized and discriminated against black persons, many of whom were caught up and made invisible, forced to find refuge in the Dome in New Orleans, which of course became a very dangerous and lethal place to be. But anyways, women, particularly in that environment, were forced to create a public and private persona to reassure their children and survive in that toxic environment. So they're masking their feelings when they're projecting themselves, for example, to the media when they put a microphone in their face, but they're also trying to deal with comforting their children who are dealing with stress, anxiety, and the kind of things that Dr. Martin spoke about earlier today. In the Bahamian political context, often those marginalized attempt to feign loyalty and fidelity to the party by ingratiating themselves to the leader privately. What do we call that in contemporary colloquial terms? Lotioning. Who said lotioning? Very good. Yes, lotioning. You all know what lotioning is? Never happened on this campus, right? Never happened on this campus. Of course, I'm teasing. More generally and practically, the secret meetings diffuses tension, allows the consolidation, if sometimes only temporary, of the leader to maintain his grip on the party, and by extension, his public perception that he has formulated a plan for addressing his critics. Returning to the Christmas coup of '63, clearly the group orchestrating the event would be identified in Scott's formulation as the powerless, using the private meeting in Pindling's home to try and challenge the direction of the party. Pindling with the aid of his NCPA comrades at the time, successfully avoids the coup and consolidates his base by eventually appointing Cecil Wallace Whitfield as chairman of the party in November of 1964, and ignoring the demands for Taylor to be appointed to the Senate. The conservatives in the party are sidelined and marginalized further, as evident in the Black Tuesday event, where apparently Adderley was not informed about the plans to throw the mace in the hourglass out of Parliament. He would eventually leave the PLP, disagreeing with the boycotting of the House of Assembly following Black Tuesday, and eventually form the NDP later that year in 1965. Now I want to turn to what I consider the most interesting political theater that doesn't get spoken about. And this is, of course, the conclave that happens in Small Hope Bay, Andros. Much of the tension between backbenchers and Pinling and his close advisors boiled over at an emergency PLP conclave held at Small Hope Bay in Andros in July of 1969. According to backbenchers Edmund Moxey and Elwood Donaldson, it was determined that the group who had opposed the appointment of Doris Johnson as a cabinet minister would use the conclave to confront Prime Minister Pinling and table a motion of no confidence in his leadership. In fact, Moxey recounted that they appeared to initially have the numbers in their favor, with 15 MPs willing to support the vote of no confidence, versus only 10 of Sir Lyndon's cabinet ministers. But watch what happens. Despite appearing to have a numerical advantage, Pinling apparently worked his political magic, calling a briefing at 2 p.m. to discuss the agenda for the official conclave and using the occasion to announce that they had just fired Arthur Folkes from his post as Minister of Tourism. So this was the meeting before the meeting. Y'all can relate to this, eh? The impact of such a pronouncement was dramatic, effectively taking the oxygen out of a room full of contentious backbenchers. Instead of demanding Pinling resign, backbenchers were left perceptibly clamoring to be considered as the new appointee to a vacant cabinet position. Pinling's savvy political move, forestalling an internal revolt within his own party, suggests he had foreknowledge of what the backbenchers were planning. Indeed, according to George Smith, Pinling acted decisively, meeting Arthur Folkes at the airport in Andros to fire him in person and prevent him from attending the conclave. You see, this idea of clamoring for power is built into Scott's theory. He suggests the example of how powerless acts to gain subtle traction occur with the leader who has the power. This means personal gain often occurs at the expense of collective solidarity. And of course, this did in fact happen in this instance, yes? You see, Pinling's savvy political move forestalled an internal revolt within his own party. It suggests he had foreknowledge of what the backbenchers were planning. And I've already mentioned the interview with George Smith. He has since passed, but he corroborated that very point. Folkes was not the only conspicuous absence from the conclave at Small Hope Bay. Apparently, Cecil Wallace Whitfield and A.D. Hanna decided to take a circuitous route to the conclave, choosing to travel by boat rather than plane. With Folkes returning to Nassau and Wallace Whitfield and Hanna delayed in arriving to the conclave, Pinling seized the moment and used the vacuum created by the firing to gather support for his cause, personally going door to door at the resort to secure the support of backbenchers who were eager to be considered for the post. But not all of the 15 backbenchers caved under Pinling's pressure. Frustrated by his fellow backbenchers' lack of courage, Elwood Donaldson rose to his feet and in his confrontational style addressed Pinling, saying that unless his attitude changed and he removed Johnson from that appointment, we would have to move a vote of no confidence because you have no confidence in us. Donaldson's scathing attack on Pinling did not end there. He further relayed to Pinling that your appointment, without even considering your members of parliament, is an insult and a lack of confidence. At that moment, Donaldson demanded that his backbenchers stand in solidarity as a signal of their vote of no confidence in Pindling. Donaldson sensed that there was reluctance by some fellow rebels. As he looked around the conference table, it appeared that they all had vaporized, sinking deeper into their seats and apparently unwilling to stand with him in the vote of no confidence. Apparently, Simeon Bowe went so low in his chair that he appeared to be on the ground. In the end, Donaldson confided that he was the lone man standing in defiance of Pindling and supporting the motion of no confidence. At that point, Donaldson took his newspaper in hand and walked out of the room, only to meet Carlton Francis outside, who in a moment of sober and cryptic assessment of the affair remarked, "Man, Ellie, this politics." The conclave at Small Hope Bay can be viewed as a turning point in the dynamics of the PLP. Pindling certainly scored a short-term strategic advantage, forestalling a rebellion of backbenchers within his party. But of course, we know that there was a storm on the horizon, and that means, of course, the formation of the Dissident Eight could in fact be traced further back to this 1969 conclave, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Pindling cleverly worked his political magic in the realm of the hidden transcript by weakening the collective of the backbenchers. Dangling a cabinet post once Arthur Folkes was fired presented individuals with the opportunity they could not miss to be elevated to an executive post in government. Returning to Scott's theory, he speaks about clamoring for power, where the powerless act to gain subtle traction with the leaders. Certainly, we see the clamoring going on right here, don't we? The other thing I find interesting, and Scott talks about how jokes and humor are often part of the hidden transcript, and we see it here with Elwood Donaldson's account. He shows a level of humor, doesn't he? The hyperbole of Simeon Bowe sinking in his seat, Carlton Francis's rather flippant remarks about "Man, Ellie, this politics," and his own self-effacing style of telling the story. But moving on now to a final example, if I could. This third example of the operation of the hidden transcript is definitely worth exploring. In this instance, the parliamentary conclave at Chub Key, Berry Islands on September 7th, 1984 is perhaps an anomaly from the traditional power play that we've seen already in our first two examples. But even still, I would argue it's definitely a case of a confrontation between the powerful and the powerless. But to get to this point, we need to give some context to this conclave, yes? So you all know this one. The context of the Chub Key conclave is very important. In September of 1983, Brian Ross, a television investigative reporter for NBC News, presented an alarming story alleging the complicity of the Pindling government in the transshipment of cocaine into the United States. The report claimed that Prime Minister Lyndon Pindling and members of his government accepted bribes from Colombian drug smugglers, and particularly from notorious Carlos Leader, co-founder of the dreaded Medellin cartel, in exchange for safe passage of cocaine and marijuana through the islands to destinations in the United States. And so, the public outcry led to the establishment of a Royal Commission of Inquiry. I believe Dr. Davis spoke about this morning, didn't he? Right, so this was a Royal Commission of Inquiry into drug trafficking and government corruption in the Bahamas. The commission convened on December 7th, 1983, and deliberated for 146 days, spread across nearly a year, with 95 days of public testimony and another 40 days of closed sessions in Nassau, and an additional 11 days of similar sessions in Miami. The Commission's report exonerated Prime Minister Pindling from allegations related to direct involvement in drug trafficking. However, the evidence published on December 14, 1984, that drug smuggling and use, I quote, posed some of the most serious social problems the Bahamas had ever faced, was a strong indictment against Bahamian law enforcement and government officials. Moreover, the Drug Commission exposed drug trafficking in virtually every one of the family islands, but particularly Bimini, Gorda Key on the southeastern tip of the Little Bahama Bank, and Norman's Key in Exuma. The Commission report was not released until December 1984, but the public hearings were already putting the government in a defensive state. Public outcry combined with media scrutiny placed the Pindling executive in a weakened state. Internally, members of Pindling's cabinet began to openly criticize the government. Leading up to the conclave in September, Hubert Ingram in particular had begun to openly criticize the government's response and the allegations emerging from the testimony. At the conclave, Prime Minister Pindling once again attempts to consolidate power and silence the internal critics within the party. Ingram is offered an additional ministry portfolio as Minister of Health to become effective the next month. Despite the offer, and this is very important, Ingram and other attendees at the conclave, including A.D. Hanna, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, and Perry Christie, do not remain silent regarding the findings of the Commission of Inquiry. After the conclave, A.D. Hanna resigns his post as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, and that happens at the beginning of October. On October 8, 1984, Christie and Ingram are fired from Pindling's cabinet. The events at the conclave and the acts of defiance by his internal cabinet remained unresolved, leading to a moment where a public action was required to resolve the tension. The hidden transcript had evolved into a public transcript. The Shapng incident reminds us that unresolved or unmitigated subtle actions within the hidden transcript can at times percolate to the surface as public discourse and definitive actions. The subtle becomes explicit. In conclusion, utilizing Scott's theory of the hidden transcript helps to explain the complexity of political behavior in the Bahamas, particularly in an environment where the narrative of a quiet revolution prevails. Subtle forms of resistance to power are often tools utilized by those without power to wield the possibility of change, or at least the diffusion of tension within the opposing groups. Put another way, the hidden transcript helps us understand strategies for survival within a complex world of power and party politics. In a tradition of constitutional democracy, often the hidden transcript is the best alternative for those seeking to challenge authority without being branded a revolutionary. Thank you. Questions? Yeah. Oh.
Thank you for the presentation. I know all of us learned something from that. The behind the scenes is just so, it should be a movie when you get the next grant. Instead of making it a book, you get a movie. Are you serious?
Okay.
Can we talk a bit about how majority rule in 67 was ushered in primarily because the two people that were going to break the tie, PLP at 18, UBP at 18, then we have Alvin Brennan, that's his name, Alvin Brennan?
Yes.
Who was an independent, and then the leader of the Labour Party, Randall Fox. They decided who would become the government. Tell us a little bit about that and helping us to understand how independents and third parties actually have a place in history and today.
It's interesting that you mentioned this. I was in a School of Social Science meeting not more than an hour ago when we were talking about the importance of third parties to the political system that we have in the Bahamas today. It is unequivocally true that without Randall Fox, and you're right to point him out not as an independent, but the leader of the Labour Party, and Alvin Brennan, who was a disgruntled former UBP, but now independent candidate, were successful in breaking the tie, which was 1818, between the PLP and the UBP. Alvin Brennan becomes Speaker of the House, and Randall Fox becomes a cabinet member. He becomes Minister of Labour. This is fascinating because there had been a huge fallout with Randall Fox and the PLP. You know, in 1956, Randall Fox ran on the PLP ticket, and he was elected along with Lyndon Pindling to the Western District. He was one of the Magnificent Six. But by the early 60s, he had had a falling out with the PLP, I think in large part because the PLP saw Pindling as the face of the party, and while both men, meaning Pindling and Fox, had a very powerful firebrand style of campaigning and speaking publicly, Pindling was seen as more of a centrist and more of a pragmatist, and Fox was seen more as a loose cannon and a firebrand speaker that would be difficult to control within the party parameters. And so Pindling became the face, and Fox removed himself from the PLP and went back to his Labour roots and again contested the 67 election as the leader of the Labour Party. So we do need to give more texture, I believe, to third parties, persons who run either independently or on a ticket other than the two legacy parties. All right, so again, we could probably look at another moment, the hidden transcript, by the way, since we're talking about it, is in 1970. All right, and this is the moment where you have the vote of no confidence in the House of Assembly, and it's in November. And guess who tables the vote of no confidence that actually begins the whole process of the dissonant eight forming? It's Randall Fox. Randall Fox is the man who tables the vote of no confidence in the House of Assembly, and then he conveniently walks out of the House and leaves everyone behind to figure out what's going to happen. And you may know the story. 8 voted no confidence in favor of it, but the majority, by a slim margin, remained in confidence of Pindling as the leader. But of course, that started a path of no return for those 8. I will also add, since you asked indirectly, there's some drama in that there was one person who remained neutral, didn't vote, and that's Tracy Thompson's dad. Tracy Thompson, of course, UB professor here and director of the World History Institute. Jeffrey Thompson did not vote. He remained silent in that casting of the vote of no confidence. But what's also interesting is Roker. Loftus Roker was found in a vehicle down the road. He didn't leave his car. And that's interesting as well, because that tells us he wasn't quite sure which way he was going to go, so he decided to stay in his car. These are stories that don't often get told, but really should, yeah? And it's part of the hidden transcript, as well as, I guess, in some instances, it becomes the public transcript. Any other questions?
Question here, or comment, Chris. Two comments. One relating to your characterization of the 62 election as a failure. In fact, PLP won the popular vote in 62. And I think that there's a narrative around that which I think needs to be questioned. 62 was not a failure of in terms of the majority expressing their wishes. It was more a failure of the decision by the Governor General that created a system that was completely expression of gerrymandering. So that's one point. And you might want to...
Let me comment on that first, and then
okay.
I'll take a second point.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree that the failure was not in the election itself. And the PLP actually had success. They won the popular vote despite a system that was absolutely rigged against them. You had, by that point in 1962, demographically, probably 70% of the population of the Bahamas residing in New Providence. They only had 7 seats. the Family Islands, where only 30% of the population resided, had like over 20 seats, right? And added to that, the Family Islands had 2- and 3-seat constituencies. They had 2- and 3-seat constituencies in Abaco, North Eleuthera, and Long Island, where you had larger enclaves of whites than anywhere else. So the system is what failed, not the PLP, okay?
And
Yeah.
if I might, it's part of part of why I want to say that is because the Turks
Yes.
in the PLP,
Mhm.
they created a narrative around 62 as a failure
Uh-huh.
because they wanted to marginalize Stevenson and Taylor.
Yes, right. And there was a rhetoric, if I could just
Right.
extend your point, there's a rhetoric of 62 failing the PLP. Again, not the PLP's failing, but the system failing them. And they carried that around the archipelago, but they also took that message international. And they targeted electoral reform as the absolute necessity moving forward. And that's why when we get to 67, you have one person, one vote. But your point about Stevenson, Taylor, and we'll add Bill Cartwright being marginalized after 62 is absolutely on point.
Yeah.
And that brings us to, of course, the coup in
And-
63.
And I want to comment about that.
Mhm.
Just questioning the characterization. 'Cause in that meeting in Soldier Road,
Mhm.
you have Butler,
Mhm.
you've got Adderley, and I don't know. I'm not sure whether we can say that they were trying to. They were actors that were expressing moderation. Certainly not Myra Butler. And I would say that even though Paul Adderley was very much an Anglophile in my view,
Mhm.
he was also one committed to change. So that just a question.
But to texturize a little bit
Yeah,
more,
yeah.
so what we have is a group of men. Primarily they're there because they don't like the fact that H.M. Taylor, the founder of the party, is now being marginalized and he's not being offered a seat in the Senate. And the new constitution will be established a couple weeks later in January of 1964. That's their primary reason for being there. But there's no doubt that those men outside of Butler, I would argue, represent a more conservative or moderate arm of the PLP. In contrast to the NCPA and these younger members who are progressively pushing the button and are advocating for demonstrations and mass gatherings and other kinds of tactics that moved the party away from what the founders were originally doing. Okay.
I see a question.
Are there any examples or case studies of the hidden transcript as it relates to the free PLP moving into the FNM? Specifically, Ingram, that is people.
Well, I'm going to give I met with my co-author yesterday, and he recommended I give another example. So this might not necessarily be, this might be somewhere between hidden and public. All right, but I'm going to throw it out since you mentioned. In the fall of 1970, in I believe it was early December, they are now fully removed from the orbit of the PLP. They're now called the Free PLP. This is even before they're branded as, well, they've already called it this in the name, but now they're starting to be called the Free PLP. They go to Grand Bahama, to a school. They have what they call the Lewis Yard Incident. And here, Cecil Wallace Whitfield, Arthur Folks, Warren Lavardi, they're standing up in there. It's a rally. They're trying to tell their supporters, you know, we still supporting the progressive movement. We just not supporting totalitarian, authoritarian, autocratic rule what we're seeing in Pinling. So they still see themselves kind of like PLPs, or might I say, still part of a progressive movement, but now they're self-identifying as free PLPs. It turns violent. People start throwing chairs at them. Wallace Whitfield has to be rescued from the stage. He's been bludgeoned by a projectile, some say even a chair, and he's bleeding from his forehead. And you could argue that that's both hidden but also public transcript, because it became well known and recognized, and there was a lot of polemical writing in the media about the event. But I think if you wanted an example, I give you that. All right. Someone else? Go ahead, Jim.
Hi, Chris. Well done. Beautiful speech. I'm not sure I know everything about this, but I think you might look at another two examples of what you're talking about with Scott. The first one is William Parliament Adderley used to hold a meeting in his store every week, I guess railing against the Bay Street Boys. The second one that I think of is William Christopher Barnett Johnson in the 1940-ish, who used to have the northern members of the party meet at his pineapple factory. And I think that might have been in support of the secret ballot. I'm not sure, but it's about that time when the secret ballot was becoming. So it's two things you might look at. And then I would like to ask you a question. What's the first political party in the Bahamas?
Okay, so I'm going to give nuance to my response as I would do as a good historian. So I argue, and it's in this forthcoming book, there are what we call proto-political organizations that predate the 1953 formation of the PLP. So going back to the 19th century, the lodges actually organized around a particular issue to advance the interests of free blacks. Prior to that, there was a free black committee headed by people like Stephen Dillett, who are advancing the cause of free coloreds and free blacks to have political rights. The 1833 Franchise Act guaranteed men of color with property could not only hold public office, but could vote in a general election. There were 3 persons of color elected by that act in 1834 to the House of Assembly, including Stephen Dillett. I think John Goodman and George LaRota would have been the other 2. So that was another kind of proto-political activism. Then in the 20th century, Jim, you mentioned the secret ballot group. Some people call it, Stephen Arner refers to them as the ballot box party. I think scholars are pretty much set on them being a group that were agitating for change, coalescing around a particular issue of open voting, which they obviously had an issue with. It is worth noting that the change they were demanding didn't come in the 1920s when they were meeting. The change did eventually come, first by act in 1946. A lot of people like A.F. Adderley and Milo Butler pressured for that reform and that act. But universal secret ballot did not get applied across the entire archipelago until 1949. Oh, let me finish, sorry. One last point. You also have the Citizens Committee, formed in 1952, that were protesting No Way Out, the Sidney Poitier film that the Bay Street Boys banned, because of course you had a black doctor with subaltern white doctors. He was the head of the department. Bay Street Boys didn't like the portrayal of Sidney Poitier in such a role, so they banned it. Citizens Committee had it overturned. So that's another proto-political organization.
The first political parties were in the 1850s.
Yeah,
when the Church Party were against the Reform Party.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that group, but I was making the case they're proto-political, Jim, because they don't actually form like a platform. They don't have paraphernalia. They don't actually have people they elected on a ticket per se.
Yeah, but it was the Church Party was the Anglicans.
Yes.
And the other party was the dissidents.
Yeah.
The Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists.
Yeah, yeah.
Those are 2 parties.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that was all because the Anglicans wouldn't let the dissidents bury people in the cemeteries.
Right.
And also the Anglican would dominating the educational process.
Right. Those comments that you made are very important, and I will add, participants that you can find that information in the new Ministry of Education history text that is being launched now. And
New history book.
yeah, the history book that Lisa's about to show us right there. And it is in chapter 5C, if you are interested in reading about the early political activism, not formally a political party, but agitating for particular change in Bahamian society.
And in my new book, The New History Book.
Yeah. Okay, is there another question? Yeah.
Dr. Curry, thank you for that. I found it extremely interesting, very entertaining.
Mhm.
But it makes me wonder, and it makes me think, right, when we hear these stories, and even if we didn't know the details of it, we're not surprised by it. We're trying to understand this, the way it goes, its political strategy, right?
It just makes me wonder if all of these important decisions are being made over here, right? In the interest of the people in the room, or people parked in their cars, or the people in the boat on their way to the meeting, right? And then at the end of it, way down on the line, right, there's an election, right, where after all of these decisions have been made, now you come to the people and say, okay, now you can choose, right? And it just makes me wonder, I mean, how do you pull from that validity in the electoral system, right? And then how does a voter, I mean, how can a voter feel like anything more than a pawn in this chess match that's going on in these closed rooms?
Yeah, the theory that Scott presents, the powerful versus the powerless, it is disconcerting, it is disturbing, but you know what we have to remember is the power is still with the people. For every moment where we have the hidden transcript, we have a Burma Road, or we have a general strike, where you have mass mobilization of people who are directing their frustration, their anger, their rage towards a particular cause, right? And so there's still power in the people. We in this country, in this particular dispensation, we have in a way become complacent to the fact that we are still change agents. And the more that we mobilize, the more that we exercise our democratic right to march on Bay Street, still the political space where people demonstrate, that hasn't changed. We have the capacity to influence by popular dissent what we would like to see done in the boardrooms, in the conclaves, wherever, because trust me, politicians, they're always feeling the pulse of the people. If they feel there's an issue that doesn't gain much traction, they ain't gonna care. They're gonna go with their private meeting, their private decision. But if an issue becomes a national concern, where people are agitating, where you could see people are unhappy, it will move the barometer. And that's what we need to do more of in this country.
So, Chris, thank you for your talk. And there are so many conversations in the last 25 years that well, no, we could go back. A very, very important conversation, which is about how we tell the history, is the conversation that led to the creation of the Free National Movement and the marriage of the UBP and the Free PLP.
Yeah.
And depending on who you talk to, the timeline and duration becomes extremely important, right? Because you had 8 people who had fought for black majority rule, and then by 1970, but really shortly, by the end of 70, or certainly going into 71, 72, the UBP and the UBP is no more. And I once interviewed the late Jeffrey Johnstone, and he wanted to take credit for that merger. But it is also the conversation that must have taken, that we know by urban legend took place between Cecil Wadsworth and Hubert Ingram.
Right, that's another one.
That resulted in him becoming leader of the Free National Movement. And if anyone remembers the call that went out for this conference,
Yeah.
intentionally put a photograph of the partners. Ingram Christie Davis. 3 partners who have all been prime minister. Wouldn't it be nice to be a fly on the wall?
Yeah, absolutely.
Today, for the conversations that have taken place around, you know, to be mischievous, whose turn it is now.
Yeah, that's powerful. I want to, if I could, just respond to what you said, Ian. The early part of 1971 just deserves more attention. There was at least 3, 4, 5 meetings in private homes in the Eastern District of New Providence, in the Fox Hill area. Jimmy Shepherd's house, and Jeffrey Johnstone's house. And the person who I relied on in my research to describe what was happening in those private meetings, Dr. Elwood Donaldson. The same guy who I relied on. I interviewed him twice. He talked in detail about Small Hope Bay, but he gave great comical details about these meetings between UBP and Free PLP. And it is a merger. It's ungetaroundable. My elder at Church of Christ, and I know one person in this room know who I'm talking about, meaning that there's no way of getting around the fact that it was a merger. Another way of putting it is it's a marriage of convenience, because they're meeting well before the by-election in September for Andros. All right, when Clarence Bain died, they had a by-election, and the Free PLP lost miserably, and they realized the writing was on the wall, but they had been meeting for months, 7, 8 months before then. Jimmy Shepherd's home, Jeffrey Johnston's home. Jeffrey Johnston had already said, and it's in public writing actually in the newspapers, we need to bury this dead horse. We need to move on and do something different. And the point I'm making though is it's cataloged in Colin Hughes' book. It's cataloged in Michael Creighton and Gail Saunders' Island is a Stream. It was a merger. The problem that one particular party has is, how do you reconcile an ideological view where you have been fighting all your life as a progressive to overthrow white minority rule, and then you turn around within a year or 2 and you join in now? Now, why is it a marriage of convenience? Free PLP had no name recognition. Even Cecil Wallace Whitfield wasn't that well known. Yes, he was a cabinet minister, former minister of education and a minister of works, but he didn't have the name recognition of Pinling. And then the second part was they didn't have no money. So the marriage of convenience is you have to marry a group that you had fought against because you need their money.
So just to say one more thing, the FNM lost every seat that was in the UBC.
In 72.
But yes.
Yes, that's correct. It's telling. The only people who won seats in 72 on the FNM ticket were people who were not originally part of the Dissident 8.
And I would argue that the Dissident won the government of the Bahamas sooner if they hadn't merged.
Yeah. The merger had a cost deficit, right? They had to reckon with the fact that some people would say they betrayed their cause in joining with the old UBP. Whether they were dead, dying, on life support, you join a group that is ideologically against what you had originally believed in. So that is why conference attendees, one could argue, and I will end on this point, that ideologically speaking, the 2 parties are right in the center, and whether PLP or FNM is really the same coin with both parties on either side. But I will also say that the personality of the leader is largely what distinguishes one party from the other. So it's a politics of personality, not ideology. And that's what we have in the Bahamas as our 2-party system today.
Okay, so we just have one last question here.
Thank you. That was a brilliant lecture, so thank you on that. You truly have educated me on things that I wasn't even aware of. So it is my understanding that these clandestine meetings can be interpreted as meetings to protect the moral code or integrity of party members. But can these clandestine meetings also be interpreted as essentially combating contradictions between public promises and private party practices as well?
Yes, it diffuses tension that in the public space around may become contradictory or might be seen as hypocritical. They have to somehow find a way of coalescing around the leader or around a particular point. And sometimes that means acquiescing through subtle acts, and oftentimes it means the leader has to give as well in offering opportunities to the dissenting members. So it's a power play that gets worked out privately, but it has ultimate repercussions in the public space. That's why I would argue sometimes these decisions do get played out eventually in public discourse once they've found a way to make peace.
Thank you very much, Dr. Curry, for your presentation. I think, having conversations around recent history, what we consider recent history,